everyone. This is Jenny from the Narrate team. This weekend marked the end of Narrate's two-part series titled Kingdom. Josh asked the question, what if outward living is a means of experiencing inward peace?
It's good to see all of you. For those of you who are guests with us, my name is Josh, and I get to serve on staff around here at Narrate. And last week we started this conversation called Kingdom. We're actually going to conclude that conversation today. And we started that conversation off last week by addressing that there's a tension that we all have to deal with in the world we live in. That is, there's a tension between how the world is and how we want it to be. And that's experienced on a collective level, that there are groups, whether families or nations, that are pining for some form of change, some way to experience the world they want it to be. And then also that's on an individual capacity as well, that there are people that are dealing with circumstances that don't reconcile with the way they want their world to be. And the example I shared for my own self is one way in which that's obvious in my own life is being an unmarried person that would love to have his own family someday. That tension becomes very apparent. And, over the past couple of years, perhaps the muscle of contentment has been developed a little bit. But before that, and really even still sometimes to this day, it's something that I have to work hard at managing myself in. And then also, I've gotten the opportunity to get to know many of you, and I've learned some of your stories, and I understand that some of you have been dealing with some circumstances in which this tension is very obvious. Some of you have had to wrestle through loss. And it could have been months, years, decades ago, and you're still having to wade through the process of grief. Some of you would love to have a little more room in your budget, to have a little more financial freedom. But it seems like as soon as you seem to be getting there, something happens, the transmission goes out, or someone gets sick, and you're back at that tension in your finances between how you want them how they are and how you want them to be. Some of you are looking for that next step. You want to find that relationship or that group of friends who you can spend time with and share life with. That job, get that degree, and then things will be better. The world will be a little more how you want it to be. And this tension is nothing new. This is something that people have been experiencing since really the beginning of human history. And Jesus entered into this tension 2,000 years ago and spoke about a kingdom. And this kingdom that he spoke of, he spoke a great deal about it. And for his original audience, the Jewish people, it kind of perked their ears a little bit, because for thousands of years, they had been experiencing oppression after oppression by different empires, but at the same time had the belief that someday God was going to act decisively on their behalf and establish a new kingdom. They would have their own home, live the way they want to live, govern themselves, and then things are going to be better for them. And so this charismatic leader, very attractive people, he started to become a bit of a celebrity in the area. This leader comes in and starts talking a great deal about a kingdom, and they start to lean forward like, hey, this could be it. It wouldn't be unlike anyone who's dealing with loneliness, and then you meet that person, and it seems like, hey, this could be it. It wouldn't be unlike dealing with some kind of relational struggle, whether it's with a spouse or an employer or a coworker, and then working through that. And it seems like things are going to get better, but then the difficulties flare up again. For these people, they start to look at Jesus like this could be happening finally. And then Jesus describes this kingdom, and it's not exactly what they were expecting. In Luke 17, we read this last week. It says this: once on being asked by the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders, when the kingdom of God would come, the one that he had been speaking a great deal about, Jesus replied, the coming of the kingdom is not something that can be observed. So it's not going to be this tangible, measurable, write down in textbooks, new government for us, nor will people say, here it is or there it is. It can't be pointed out, because the kingdom of God is in your midst. And many scholars would say that in your midst would be more properly translated as within you. And so what Jesus does in describing this kingdom is he points out two things. That first off, this kingdom is not something outside that you can observe. It's in you. And then also, it's not then when this happens, then our lives will be better. Rather, this kingdom is in the present. It exists right now. And for these people, whenever they heard this, they were profoundly disappointed. And that would be, again, like, it seems like that change that you've been wanting, it seems like it's about to come through, and then it falls through. This is an emotion, a feeling, an experience that these people had and that we still have today. And so it begs the question, was Jesus just this unattached philosopher that threw out these pithy statements that had way too much room for interpretation? But then we talked about last week how this description of the kingdom is surrounded by a narrative of Jesus' life in which he lived with an impeccable character and loved people, and mind you, the most unlovable in a way that was unprecedented. And so what if these words, in the context of the way Jesus lived, were remarkably caring and could be remarkably helpful to these people and then also to us? Jesus, by saying these words, what if he was saying that this kingdom, it's not when this happens, then it's going to be better. Because if you get the next step, then what's the next one? It's step after step after step. And then also on top of that, to live a win-then lifestyle is really to live in despair. For me, as I had mentioned just a moment ago, that being an unmarried person that would love to have his own family someday, to think that I cannot be happy until that happens is a miserable, despairing way to live. And so Jesus comes in and says, no, it doesn't work that way. This kingdom and the peace and grace and hope and joy and love that can be experienced in it is available to you now. In fact, one point Jesus says in John 8 that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And so what if the truth of the kingdom was that it could set you free from perpetually living in a world in which there's a tension between how it is and how you want it to be, and you think that if I could just get that thing, then things would be so much better? Jesus is saying, no, you can experience peace now. Now, with that said, the kingdom, and you can go to that next slide, Mick, the kingdom sounds great, right? But then why am I not experiencing it? Jesus, you say that there is grace and peace available within the kingdom that is within me right now, but why am I not experiencing it? For one, we talked last week that trust is a big component in this equation, and that in trust there's more peace available to us. And obviously, that's a very difficult thing to do. Some of you are going through some very real circumstances. And to trust requires an immense amount of work. And that's not without that's with all due reason. So trust can be difficult. But then some of you've developed a skill of trusting, despite what circumstances you're dealing with. But even then, you still have to wrestle with the anxiety and angst and difficulty that comes with certain circumstances. In moments of peace, they're far and few in between. It kind of reminds me of, I have a friend named Chris, and we live together in Bozeman with a few other guys. Once or twice a summer, over the 3 summers that we all lived together, we would go down to Moab, Utah, and go climbing down there and canyoneering down there and playing around in the national parks and rappel off of arches. And one trip, we'd already done it several times before, but one particular trip, we decided to leave on a Wednesday night. And so we left on a Wednesday night. We got there to Moab on a Thursday morning. And we were going to start off our trip by canyoneering. And then in this canyon that we were going to hike down, there was a couple of arches that we were going to rappel down. They were both about 150 feet apiece. And we're hiking down this trailhead. We get there in the morning, park at the trailhead, hike down, rappel down the first arch, and then hike down some more. And we get to the second arch. And then we bump up on top of that arch, seriously, like 35 retirees with, 20-year-old guides. And it just kind of dawns on us, this is going to take a while. Because they only had so many anchors on top of the arch that you could anchor your rope into and then rappel off of. And Chris, especially, but really all of us too, we were just kind of those people that whenever we're down here, we're going to take advantage of every moment. And so, we're kind of like, okay, what are we going to do for the next 2 hours? And personally, I was like, well, I just guess we'll have to wait. No big deal. There's safety in an anchor, and I'm willing to wait for it. And Chris is like, no, let's figure out some other way. And so I'm starting to feel a little nervous, and Chris says, I know what to do. I've actually done this before. What we can do is instead of using an anchor, we can tie 2 ropes together and lay it over the top of the arch, and then get 2 people. There's a group of 6, so we're going to have 3 pairs, 2 people, and pair them up as near, their weight had to be as close as possible, and then we can both rappel at the same time, and each other can serve as one another's anchor. And I'm like, Chris, come on, man. And he's like, trust me, I've done this before. Okay, all right, I trust you. And then so we pair up, and I'm paired up with this guy whose name was Josh as well. And Chris is like, okay, who wants to go first? Crickets. And finally, Josh and I decided, all right, we'll do it. And so we get on top of the arch, and we get our harness on, and get our rope running through our belay device, and we slowly start backing away from one another. This arch is probably 15 feet wide, and then we're getting nearer to the edge, and so we kind of lay down, and we're slowly creeping off the arch, and I am totally terrified. Chris is like, hey, how you doing? I'm like, I'm fine, Chris, I'm fine. And then we start coming down the arch, or coming down off of the arch, and we're both about 10 feet below it. And so, I'm looking up at the arch, I'm looking at Josh across from me, and I've got about 140 feet of potential death between me and the ground. And as soon as I realized that we were okay, that this method was going to work, that there was enough friction on the rope on top of the arch, that we weren't going to be sliding around, I just started feeding that rope through my belay device, because all they wanted to do was be on the ground. Because for the past 5 minutes, my stomach was in 50 knots from how nervous I was. And so I just wanted to make sure that if I could start lowering myself fast, that I'm not going to fling Josh over the arch and to his death. And so I just start going down, and I get on the ground. And as soon as I got on the ground, I felt okay. But what I experienced in that 5-10 minutes of interaction with Chris is, first off, Chris is someone who I had spent a great deal of time outdoors with. We had done a lot of climbing together. He was very experienced, climbed all over the U.S. and South America. Just a mega athlete, and also a safe person. But despite the fact that I had complete trust in Chris and our friendship that we had had for the past few years and the adventures that we had gone on together, I was still filled with this anxiety, with all due reason, during those moments. I was a wreck for a little bit. Which isn't unlike the fact that sometimes some of us are in certain circumstances, and we have a trust that God is with us and that God is for us. But even still, sometimes those circumstances can be so difficult, and they can be difficult to manage ourselves in. Jesus gave a sermon. It's the greatest sermon ever given. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And in this sermon, he dealt with several different topics. But he concluded the sermon with a a description on if you follow what I say, then I promise you, your life will be more stable and peaceful. The text says this in Matthew 7. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. The circumstances became difficult, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Jesus gave this. He said this at the conclusion of a sermon that he gave. But I don't think it's intellectually dishonest to apply these words to the whole of Jesus' teaching and to the sum of Jesus' teaching, which he sums up at one point. Someone asked him, what is the most important thing we can do? As far as the way to live, what is the most important thing we can do? And Jesus responded with, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So what if in loving God and loving others, there is an opportunity to experience a peace that is resilient, just like the metaphor that he gave of a house being built on a rock? So I got a question for you. What if outward living is a means of experiencing inward kingdom peace? Now, love is such a big word, and it means so many things. In our culture, it's described in so many different ways. People say they love hot dogs, and that just cannot be true, right? But the Apostle Paul, one of the first Christian leaders, he described love in 1 Corinthians 13. And many times, if you're a churchy like me and you hear about 1 Corinthians 13, your mind immediately goes to like Christian Valentine's Day cards. But this description of love that Paul gives is within a description of he's talking about gifts, and he says that no matter how you are gifted, if you do not exercise those gifts in love, then your gifts are worthless, which is a strong statement. And personally for me, it's kind of hard to buy that. But if those gifts aren't exercised in love, then they're worthless. And so what if love, as described by Paul in 1 Corinthians, is the way that you support and serve those whom you share life with on an everyday basis? Paul says this: love is patient and love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, hopes, perseveres. Love never fails. The kingdom doesn't promise that everything's going to be perfect all of the time. Jesus mentions that whenever he's describing the house on the rock. It doesn't say that the winds aren't going to blow, that the streams aren't going to rise. The kingdom doesn't promise that everything is going to be perfect all the time. But what if, in living outwardly, we are taking another step toward experiencing peace that is available to us in the kingdom? Because think about whenever you're dealing with that tension between how the world is and how you want it to be. Think about the feelings, the emotions that you can have, which are often valid and very much a part of you. Some people like to neglect emotions. No, they're very much a part of you. So we need to be aware of them and manage them. And in some circumstances, there's despair. In some circumstances, there's impatience. Some there's anger. Some there's envy, pride. And Paul says that with love, these feelings and these emotions, the ones that are negative and perhaps even destructive, can be at least diminished, if not eliminated. Because love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not easily angered. It kind of reminds me of a friend of mine who I met just a few weeks ago at our high school camp called Super Summer. His name is Peter, and myself and several counselors and leaders, we all came to the camp a day before the students showed up, and so we kind of got an opportunity to get to know one another, and I befriended this guy named Peter, and he was super shy and super quiet that first day, and really the first few days into the camp. It wasn't until the last couple of days that we finally started to get to know one another. But we kind of became friends over the course of the week. Peter is a Native American. He's from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which if you know anything about Pine Ridge, it is one of the most broken communities in the U.S. And he was born into this community. His mother was 15 years old and also an alcoholic whenever he was born. And he lived with her for his first couple of years of life, and he learned Lakota, his native language. And then after a couple of years, he was taken from her and started going through the foster care system. And in the foster care system, he says he remembers that even as a toddler, he was experiencing the language difficulty, the language barrier, and the stress that comes with that because they didn't speak Lakota and he didn't speak English, and there was really no way for them to teach him how to speak English. And so he's dealing with that stress. And then on top of that, he said every few months he was going to a new home. And so as a young boy, as a toddler, he's experiencing abandonment after abandonment after abandonment. And then not all foster care homes are like this, but he experienced some in which he had to deal with abuse as well. And this is a little boy. And I don't think Peter was exaggerating the story. He was such a quiet, meek, humble person. It's just that over the course of the week of spending a deal of time together, he started to become a little more open with me in those last couple of days. And here's the kicker for me. He said at one point, this is the night before, this is the last night. I remember the first time someone asked me to sit down next to them at a table. Can you imagine going through so much difficulty and abandonment and abuse as a boy that you remember the first time someone asked you to sit down next to them? For me, that was commonplace. I was showered with love. And the first years of this precious boy's life were filled with neglect and abandonment. And so, we continued talking about his life and through that evening. And he met Jesus as a late teenager in Cody, Wyoming. And I asked him, because there's a little bit of clash between Native American history and Christian history, what makes you compelled to believe in Jesus? And he said, there's a nearness that is available in Jesus that I haven't experienced before from any other deity. And in that, I found wholeness and some redemption from all of the difficulties that I've gone through. But then, like any person, for someone to experience those kind of circumstances at a young age, in their toddler years and in their adolescence, it's not like once the circumstances end that it's all better now. He's going to have to be wrestling with the emotional difficulties that are rooted in those years. And so I asked him, how are you doing? I mean, your story is dramatic and painful. How are you doing okay now? And he said, well, first off, I don't neglect what is within me. I'm trying to work on the pains that I had to deal with as a young man. And so, I'm addressing that there are some things that I am carrying that I want to be free from. But he said, whenever I focus just inwardly on myself, and he said, I've gone through this for a couple of years now and learned what not to do. Whenever I just focus on myself, I fall back into a rut of depression. And he said it was extremely severe. He would be in his home for days and weeks, and even to the point of losing weight because he'd ate up all his food and didn't go out to buy any more food. And so he said, what I need to do now is I focus a little bit on what's within me, but then I turn outward. And so I just take little steps. Okay, I'm going to address this problem that's in me because of the circumstances I dealt with as a young man. And then those outward steps are sharing his story with many who have had similar experiences to him, friends and family, volunteering at a homeless shelter, volunteering at his church. And he said, coupling that outward living with inward therapy is the combination that I need to be okay, to not fall back into a rut of depression, and then also to serve those whom I am sharing life with. And it was just for me like an aha moment. There have been times whenever I've become so self-centered on what I'm dealing with that I forget about the fact that there are many around me that are dealing with difficulties that are far worse than mine. And then also, though the fact that that's not to say that the things that I've had to wrestle through have been easy, but what if I don't have to dwell on them perpetually? That I can focus my attention and my heart, and as Paul says, my love on those that surround me and that I share life with. So what if in outward living, we have an opportunity to experience an inexplicable inward peace? And so just to be practical, who is someone you can go to that next slide. Who is someone you feel led to love? Just one person. Do for one what you wish you could do for many. And then what are 3 ways that you could love them? It could be someone that's going through some form of a loss, and you can be there to support them in that loss. It could be someone that's going through a transition and they don't know what's on the other side of that transition, and you can support them in that transition. The opportunities are endless, right? But who is one person that you can intentionally love, that you can intentionally live outwardly toward, who you can embrace love toward them the way it's described by Paul? And what if in that, of course you're helping that person, but also you're doing a great favor to yourself. The same way that Peter serves himself by serving others. We see an example of this in the person of Jesus. As Jesus is about to die, about to be crucified, murdered. And you know, the thing that I've been reading that story a little bit lately, and the thing that's kind of hit me is I can imagine how alone he felt. Everything was falling apart. All of his loved ones that he had shared so much time and heart with over the years were now neglecting and denying him. I can imagine how alone he felt. But what's he doing? He is an avenue of kingdom peace, of kingdom forgiveness, of kingdom love, by stating that, God, forgive these people who are doing this to me. And so for you, Narrate, if you're a Christ follower and you have been for decades, what if we continued to embrace that Christianity is not just a spiritual, for want of a better term, a spiritual system that is inwardly focused but also outwardly focused? And what if you, who are just exploring the person of Jesus, could give this outward living thing a try? And maybe then you can experience some peace. And maybe then the tougher things like the virgin birth, the death, and the resurrection is like, no, I believe this Jesus. Because the principles that he has taught and my application of those principles have led me to experience a peace that is like a house on a rock. Who is someone you feel led to love? And what if in serving them, you are also serving yourself? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your kingdom. Thanks that you're rescuing us from thinking that it's the next step. But God, you've shown that there is peace and grace and hope and joy available now. And it requires, for many of us, it requires an immense amount of trust. Help us with that trust, God. We believe, but help us with our bits of unbelief. And God, you have also shown that a means of obtaining inward peace is to live outwardly. We ask for someone to love and ways to love them, direction on ways to love them, so that they can experience the kingdom and that we too can experience the kingdom now that is within us. Thank you for your example in Jesus, who was loving even in his darkest moment. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.